Thanks very much. Thanks to Father Philip for the invitation. My apologies for, the sort of the health issues at the last minute, but, thanks very much for all the accommodation. And indeed, thanks very much to Sarah. She got her handout to me, in good time. So I had time to reflect on what she was going to say, and I've, jotted down a few notes, a few responses. And I thank her for not pulling any punches. I myself am a fighter, so I like that. I like that attitude in philosophy. So I will pull my punches, okay, because I'm not the main speaker, but I'll just give a few, sort of responses, a few, sort of dodges and dives just to see where the Thomas could go with what Sarah was saying. But brilliant paper, Sarah. Thanks very much for the presentation. The first thing that I would like to say is I'm wondering, is suspicion the right approach that we should adopt when relating to a philosophical position that's not our own, or maybe is outside a tradition of philosophy that we don't engage in? Now, I'm one who is suspicious of analytic philosophy and the analytic engagement with Thomism, and I've published to that effect in the past. But that suspicion comes from having gone through the entire analytic project, or having gone through representatives of the analytic project and come out the other end thinking, well, I, as a Thomist, somebody who thinks that Aquinas was right in certain issues, I don't think that there can be sort of, dialogue on these certain issues. I think there are just some sort of, aspects which, they're in you can't get across it. So I think suspicion is right when you come out the other end of engaging with a philosophy. I'm not so sure it's the right position to adopt when engaging initially with a philosophy, and that's just by way sort of of an overview. But with regard to the three skepticisms that Sarah brought up, the first one was a suspicion about the foundational tenets of Thomism. Now, one of the things that we like to say about Thomas is that he is a systematic thinker. And as a systematic thinker, he is systematic in his distinction of philosophy from theology. Even when he writes as a theologian, for example, in his commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius, even when he's writing explicitly as a theologian, he makes it clear that philosophy and the formal subject matter of philosophy is distinct from that of theology. And he's one of the first people in the history of philosophy to do that. The subject matter of metaphysics as first philosophy is being qua being, or ens commune, or however, whatever designation you want to take from Aquinas' writings. Whereas the subject matter of theology proper is God, of which Thomas says you need some sort of revelation to do theology proper. So the subject matter of metaphysics as first philosophy does not include God, and is systematically distinct from theology, whose subject matter does include God as he's revealed himself. So Thomas does carve out an independent philosophical way of thinking, free from considerations within theology. This is why I don't think it's quite accurate to say that every aspect of Aquinas' system involves the existence of God. Certainly those aspects of Aquinas' system that I engage with and publish on, his metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of nature, philosophy of mind, logic of demonstration, action theory, even some of his moral philosophy, God doesn't come into it. Issues pertaining to essence and existence, matter, form, substance, participation, causality, as Sarah rightly pointed out, they don't involve, appeals to God, and they don't need God. They might end up leading to God, but they don't need God in order for the discussions to go ahead. And this kind of brings us to the second point, the mistrust of the methodology. And this is the sort of idea of Thomists treating Thomas as if he were infallible, as if what he writes is correct just because Thomas wrote it. And, that's what we do when we're Thomists. It's certainly not the attitude that I as a Thomist would take, and it's certainly not the attitude that I find when I read other Thomists. It's certainly the attitude of, I think, social media apologists and their use of Thomism, but it's not the attitude of, professional, philosophers, theologians who engage with Thomas. I think the attitude is one that, Sarah, as you pointed out, that you find with, say, some Kantians, some followers of Lewis, even Hegelians, other people like that within the analytic tradition. It's not an infallibilism, when somebody is a Thomist or a Kantian. It's rather that those of us who follow that system, we think that this author was right about the issues of philosophical importance that we're interested in. So let's say if I'm a Thomist metaphysician, as I am, I think it's because Thomas was right about generally, every question of importance in metaphysics. And those questions of importance in metaphysics that I've written and published on, I think, Thomas just got it right there. And so I seek to defend Thomas on this particular issue. And, Thomas can do that with regard to other systematic issues as well. And this, I think, is precisely because Thomas himself carves out philosophy as an area of systematic concern, independent from theology, and one which has to be engaged with systematically, or one could say analytically. And that raises the question, Sarah, as you pointed out, why Aquinas? Why should analytical philosophers be bothered with Aquinas and not, any one of the other guys, such as, Kant or Hegel or somebody like that? And that's a good question. And, that's one for the Thomists to address, because it's up to us Thomists to say, well, look, we think that Thomas was right about essence and existence, or about causality, or participation, or the mind-world relation, or any other number of philosophical topics. That's what we Thomists have to do in trying to convince other philosophers, well, this is a position worth taking seriously. And as I'm going to argue tomorrow, one of the strengths of Thomism is that he overcomes certain problems. Thomas overcomes certain problems generated by modern philosophy when a certain attitude towards the mind-world relation was adopted. If one doesn't adopt a certain attitude towards the mind-world relation, let's say, or if one is seeking to overcome that sort of starting point on the mind-world relation that we get, say, in post-Cartesian philosophers, Thomism provides a pretty good, I'm going to argue, position on mind and world, and one that kind of coheres with what we're getting by certain post-Kantian engagements in analytical philosophy on mind and world. And then we come to the last suspicion that Sarah brought up, and this is mistrust of the practitioners of Thomism. And I mean, I can see the point here, the mistrust of the practitioners, and as Sarah helpfully pointed out, that this goes both ways. And I suppose one of the things I would like to, sort of point out, just as a methodological point, is that the identity of the philosopher or the thinker really ought not to affect the evaluation of the philosophy or the thought. Okay, so what the philosopher thinks, okay, that the evaluation of that really ought not to be affected by the identity of the philosopher. And I think, Sarah, that you did grant that this was more of a kind of a social sort of issue, that, whilst we're engaging with the objectives, of the philosophy of question, sometimes, at the back of our mind, we're thinking, well, really, this is sort of setting this individual here, who's in a different life world from me, it's sort of setting off alarm bells. But I mean, I think as philosophers, and I think if we're trying to be, analytical philosophers in that logically rigorous way that's been sort of highlighted in the two papers, we kind of have to set that aside, because those sorts of, sort of maybe feelings of distance from the life world of the other philosopher, they're not relevant to the logical or the conceptual rigor that analytical philosophy is after. The various social, political, and religious disagreements that we can see that can divide people, for philosophers, they can be philosophically motivated. So, I mean, having different social and political views, there can be philosophical motivations for those, genuine philosophical motivations for those. And so the disagreements at base are philosophical disagreements, and not just, sort of ones of, a particular worldview or life world. So there are these principal disagreements which philosophers can have on social and political issues, and indeed Thomists do adopt the positions that they adopt on social political issues on the principles of the Thomistic philosophy that they're willing to defend. So there can be a principal disagreement had even over those issues where we see that we're at a distance from one another on kind of our worldviews, and given that it's a principal disagreement, it's one which in principle is capable of being overcome through dialogue and discussion. The last point I want to make then, so I like the way, Sarah characterized analytical philosophy as flexible, but I think, this can be somewhat Janus-based, and it's because, yes, analytical philosophy is flexible, and it has shown itself, at least in the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, as, embracing all different kinds of philosophical concerns, when maybe prior prior to, say, the work of Quine and the two dogmas of empiricism. There was a very, sort of strict set of concerns it was concerned with. My question then is, what makes it analytic? That's what I want to know. And this has been my complaint in the past against analytical Thomism, is that it seems to me that there's nothing specifically analytic about analytical philosophy. And what was mentioned by Mac at the beginning, and then sort of, Sarah, you made the point as well, that there's a certain logical and conceptual rigor to analytical philosophy. And well, if that's the case, if what's analytic about analytical philosophy is logical and conceptual rigor, or if that's sufficient to include somebody among the ranks of analytical philosophy, I would like to know the difference then between a philosopher like Heidegger or a philosopher like Hegel, who, logically and conceptually rigorous, so logically and conceptually rigorous, they're almost impenetrable. And I know, and I grant, Sarah, that you did say that, you think that we can have analytical continental philosophers. But it seems to me that by including, by being able to include certain thinkers into analytical philosophy, such as Heidegger and Hegel, and also Father Thomas made the point in response to Mac's paper that, there are certain portions of Aristotle's thinking, and even thinkers beyond Aristotle, who exhibit this sort of logical and conceptual rigor. It seems to blur the boundaries of analytical philosophy, and it means that analytical philosophy is much wider and much older than its practitioners, and certainly its originators took it to be. And so I'm wondering then what the difference is between analytical philosophy conceived in that way and just philosophy. And another point I would like to make on that is that, we seem to be including analytical philosophers here who are not typically taken to be representative of analytical philosophy, but we could also be excluding certain analytical philosophers who might be paradigm cases of, analytical philosophy. I'm thinking of somebody like Wittgenstein in his later work. That logical and conceptual rigor, I mean, when one reads the investigations, sure, you might see, certain common themes running throughout it, but the amount of aphorisms and unexplored thoughts in the investigations, not just in the investigations, and other works in and around that period or leading up to that period, would seem to suggest that, Wittgenstein isn't a great representative of this analytical school with its logical and conceptual rigor. And to my mind, that sort of takes away the sort of any sort of strict identity conditions for analytical philosophy, and renders the project of bringing analytical philosophy and Thomism close together something of a bit of a red herring, because if that's what analytical philosophy is, then it seems to me that it's just philosophy, and we're just trying to bring philosophy and Thomism together. But Thomism is philosophy, by Aquinas' own terms. He carves out space for philosophy, and so I don't see analytical philosophy as doing anything more than a kind of a social or political sort of work within the philosophical traditions. But other than that, it's a great paper, and I'm only sorry that I can't, be with you more, Sarah, to chat about this and, discuss it even further. But I'm happy for you to take the reins now, Sarah.
So thanks so much to Gaven. That was great. I'm really sorry I can't meet you in person here. I thought those were great comments, and I'll try to give just some off-the-cuff answers to these comments. So first, Gaven asked, is suspicion the right approach here? Yeah, I don't necessarily think it is. One thing I'm trying to do just, in this talk is give voice to maybe, like the form of suspicion some people might have. But as for the question, should we all approach each other suspiciously? I definitely think not, especially if engagement and philosophical progress is the goal. I think what we have to do is try to look for points of commonality, both methodologically, but also topically, in order to make progress. And I actually think there's just is a lesson that applies to analytic philosophers, even within our own little club as well, right? Who hasn't been in a really antagonistic Q&A, even when we're all methodologically on the same side and trying to figure out the same questions. So, a friendliness and openness to points of contact, I think, is definitely the way to go if we want to make progress. Yeah, the kind of interesting point about philosophy and theology and the relationship between those in the Thomistic system, and especially the kind of, we don't need God to kind of hold the Thomistic view of causation, for example. I think that's a nice point. On the other hand, this gets into some of the things that were said later in the commentary. I think one form of suspicion on the part of analytic philosophers is that, Thomists think they already know the answer. And so, well, in principle, we might not need God for, the answer to the question of what is causation. In practice, I feel like analytic philosophers will be thinking to themselves, wait for it. And then when God comes out, we're like, yes, I knew that was being part of the answer. I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm not saying that's the right approach. But, one problem is whether or not these things are in principle separable. In practice, I think they're not often treated that way. And so maybe treating them that way more in general would help get rid of some of the suspicion there. Then there's this question, should philosophers think that, their own opinions or their own backgrounds or their own ideas affect the evaluation of arguments? So Gaven, rightfully points out on a particularly strict kind of conception of analytic philosophy, or actually just many conceptions, most analytic philosophers aren't going to want to admit that their own ideas or opinions infects their precise logic choppy arguments. I guess I actually have some mixed feelings about this. There is a debate across academic subfields in general, not just philosophy, about the extent to which like a historical or a ideological work is even possible, right? Even in math right now, there's some debate about whether ideology affects mathematical truths and stuff like that. And so while I think there is a particularly sort of like pure idea of what analytic philosophy is like totally unrelated to like our historical moment or our like personal background ideologies. In fact, I think all of those things really do creep in no matter who we are and no matter which side of the divide we're on. Our arguments, the topics we work on, the modes we publish in, the people we talk to, and some of the methods are going to be infected a bit by who we are, the moment we live in, things that shouldn't technically sort of infect, how good of an argument something is, but in fact, I think they do. And so at least for me, I think it's just better to recognize that, to be like, yep, we all have this background coming into it. It's important to make it explicit, and then we can just sort of argue about things while making explicit what our own ideologies are. I do think it's important for everyone to admit that they have an ideology. When it's one party saying, oh no, I'm the one totally uninfected by the current historical moment in ideology, you're the ideological one, that's unhealthy. But if we can all admit it, work on it, make it explicit, that will help us make some philosophical progress. And then the last great point, what is analytic about analytic philosophy? Where do we put people like Heidegger and Hegel, Wittgenstein? So I'm like, full disclosure, I might be out of the norm here, but I think analytic philosophy does encompass all of those people, or at least certain aspects of their system. I do think it's a really big tent. I've actually always thought the analytic continental divide is really more sociological than methodological. Not saying that's true across the board. I do think some of the differences are just like stylistic, like it's pretty different to read David Lewis or Frege than to read like Heidegger or Nietzsche. They're just sort of like different artistic experiences. It doesn't necessarily mean they're totally different topically or methodologically. I've actually been wanting to teach a class for a long time on the continental analytic divide and whether or not it's really a divide. So I fear I might just be like a more sympathetic ear than most with respect to this point. Father Philip Neri, in his comments on Mac, worried about the problem of overgeneration and undergeneration. Like, are we kind of saying that too many things are analytic philosophy or too few things are analytic philosophy? I think I probably fall on the too many side of it. Like, for example, I think on a certain conception of analytic philosophy, some theoretical physicists are really going to turn out to be philosophers. They should take that as a compliment, but somehow I won't think they will. Some theoretical mathematicians, a couple mathy poets, right? Like there are going to be more people in the tent, I think, that are traditionally thought to be so, but that does just represent kind of my first sort of view of methodology, and that can be debated. Thanks so much, Gaven.